Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 132, brought to you by executive producer Adam Dickinson. Thank you very much for your support. You just heard Prayer of Hatred from Morbid Angel's Formulas Fatal to the Flesh, and this is the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And we've made it to the F album. It's kind of strange.
Well, and also, if anybody cares, Trey had a lot of expert kind of guidance, I think, through this. Is Formulas Fatal to the Flesh. F is the sixth letter of the alphabet.
Yeah.
Times 3, 666, Mark of the Beast. Boom.
Oh, wow.
Blew your mind, right?
Dang. I hadn't even
very junior high.
Yeah, but that's speaking of junior high. That's kind of the mind of Trey. How would you pronounce his last name?
It's completely. I heard him on an MTV. You can look it up on YouTube. Maybe I'll link to it in the show notes or something. But he actually did a Headbangers Ball thing where he was like hosting the show.
Oh yeah, cool.
with just him. But he's like, "Hey man, it's Trey Gazagazagoth or something." But he had like the crazy pronunciation of it. Huh. It's I think it's all H.P. Lovecraftian, Cthulhu-ish Necronomicon crap. So I just call him Trey.
Trey, yeah. Everyone knows Trey from Morbid Angel.
Yeah.
Different than Trey and Anastasio from Fish.
Oh, absolutely.
They're kind of
they're the counter of one another.
They are. Well, they are, but they both live in excess in a strange sort of way. So they probably have more in common than you would.
They might do it. Hell, they might do a record together next after the newest Morbid Angel.
Well, we have to give credit where credit's due, and tonight we're going to be looking at the Steve Tucker-era of Morbid Angel. Probably a phrase that you never thought you'd heard uttered in a serious journalistic sort of way, but Albert Mudrian from Decibel sent us an email a few weeks ago and said, I've got an idea for you guys. I think it would be really interesting in light of the new Morbid Angel record, which is under a considerable amount of controversy.
Controversy, as they say overseas.
Yeah. Not very well liked, we could say, from the critical or from the fan standpoint at this point.
Yeah.
And so Albert said, in light of that, it kind of makes you appreciate the Steve Tucker era a little bit more. And so I said, hey, we're up for the task. What a timely, historical, relevant kind of show we could possibly have, even though the Morbid Angel record's been out, for a couple months at this point by the time you're hearing this. But still, it's in the realm of discussion. And so we took up the task. And, I've always myself been a really huge fan of Formula's Fate of the Flesh. I know you were a latecomer to it because this came out in an era where you were kind of out of a lot of the metal stuff, 98. You were kind of you and Chris had kind of...
That was my metal hiatus.
Yeah, you were on metal hiatus. And the only reason I think I really, really got in this record...
Although I did have a promo of it.
Did you? Okay. Yeah. Well, the cover's so terrible, you probably just were like, not interested.
Yeah, sat in a pile for a long time. Actually, the back cover where it was like them like superimposed over nature photography looked much more interesting.
Oh, yeah, it was way better, for sure. But I had to review this for one of the very first issues I ever wrote for Eclipse, like Eclipse number 1 or 2. And so I had to become intimate with the record, and Chris was very disinterested in Morbid Angel at this point. If
anybody doesn't know what Eclipse is, Eclipse magazine was, and if anybody doesn't know what, we'll do a really quick, brief history lesson.
Oh, go ahead.
1992, I think, is when the Requiem magazine started, where this podcast got its namesake. When the Requiem podcast or Requiem zine dismantled, Chris went on and formed Eclipse, which is another long-running fanzine that all of us were involved with.
And that's kind of where Mark and I intersected, was both through working at the record store and working on Eclipse, drafting him back to be the art director.
Yes, because you needed me.
We did need you. It was
badly.
we were doing the best we could with limited late 90s computer technological resources of
and even hijacking people that did ad design for newspapers that didn't know what they were doing then. So
it was not good. So Formulas kind of comes out in that era in a strange sort of way. But, Gateways, when that came out, which Gateways to Annihilation, the second Steve Tucker record we'll be talking about, that was a record I had for a while, and I remember kind of listening to it, but it came out in such a weird era in the early 2000s where...
It was 01, wasn't it, when that came out?
Yeah, and we were very much into the Swedish stuff, and a lot of just other things were happening.
When I think we were starting to branch out a little bit too with Catatonia and Converge were putting out Jando
Electric
and all that
Wizard
kind of stuff.
And it was just a lot of different stuff. And so that record didn't really, it fell in the midst of an era where maybe American death metal didn't have a lot of weight at that point. It's it was good, but I kind of put it away and didn't really get into it. And then Heretic, I never really heard until recently. It was kind of a record that came out, and I had not heard great things about it, and I wasn't really blown away at that point by Gateways, and
especially with the double disc version that came out with basically the glorified advanced levels thing. I mean, it was all video game
demos and stuff like that. Yeah. So it was interesting for us from that standpoint to go back and revisit this stuff, is where I'm kind of getting at in a long-winded sort of way. And I've come away with a greater sense of appreciation, I think, of the Steve Tucker era.
I think Formulas is an Annihilation or Gateways, to a lesser degree. I think it's a good record, but I think Formulas it stands up with everything else that they ever did. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
I wonder if we should go into a little bit of the current.
Yeah.
state of Morbid Angel.
Go ahead,
15 years after David Vincent left on the Domination record. This has been in the works since like 2000, since Decibel first started. I remember seeing
2005, 2006.
Yeah, Morbid Angel cover, touting the return of Morbid Angel.
Yeah.
They've done live shows and stuff, but
Sure.
everybody's wanted to hear, the new record. And I think last year sometime they put out the single for Nevermore, which basically, it was very similar to what they did in Domination and Covenant, just a little bit more modernized, I guess. And that got me kind of excited to hear the new stuff. And this is an interesting thing because Jason hasn't heard the record at all.
I have avoided it.
You've heard Nevermore, though,
Yeah,
right?
I have.
Okay.
And I liked it. Yeah.
But the new record, I think it's
like the plague.
is it Illude Divinium Insanus, I believe is what it's called.
It's the I record.
The I record, and hopefully we don't get to Z at this point. But maybe
they'll bring Steve Tucker back.
Wow, it's I don't even know if that will help at this point. But it's such an uneven record, and I mean, there's been tons of coverage about people talking about things. But I'll just give you my 2 cents on it. I think this would have been a fantastic EP with 4 songs. It would have been exactly what people wanted, which you got to give it to them to some degree, even though they put out kind of a less than stellar record. They did what they wanted to do, and that's pretty much what every artist wants to do.
Sure.
You don't want to have to, okay, you just say if you write novels, you don't always want to have to write crime novels or something. You want to spread your wings a little bit. But this seems very throwback to the 90s as far as electronics are concerned. They seem very haphazard and weird. A lot of, even in, I believe it's on Prayer of Hatred, there's like a little bit of almost like the shimmering kind of keyboards behind it.
Yeah, there's a sense of that, but it's not. When we get into formulas, I'll talk about the technology.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of the precursors, the impetus, a lot of what will end up coming up on this new record in those, but the way they kind of like it's all kind of layered and nice in this stuff that we're going to hear.
Sure.
In the new record, it's very blatant and obvious. There's lots of industrial overtones. There's a song called Red Occult, written by Mr. David Vincent, which sounds like a Marilyn Manson B-side.
Yeah.
I mean, to a T, from whatever the first record came out, like 95 or 96 or something.
Probably from the Antichrist Superstar era.
Yeah, and there's no, because you look at the cover of the new record, it looks solid. The name sounds okay, very death metal-esque. And then you look at the names of some of the songs. I mean, I'll give you the songs that you should listen to. Go to YouTube, you can probably find them. Here, Existo Vulgari is a decent song. Blades of Baal is also okay. I Am Morbid, I kind of think it's funny because it's almost like an anthemic, like heavy metal song. So that's on the cusp of it, I guess. Nevermore, and then Beauty Meets Beast. But then you've got Too Extreme, and then Radical Destructo versus Earth. I mean, it's just it's
named after some of the Japanese animation kind of stuff, is what a lot of that sort of sounds like. Which is one of Trey's fascinations.
With I can't say this because I'm not like I don't have any kind of musical history, or I'm not like I mean, for all intents and purposes, Morbid Angel is one of the most important bands in death metal ever.
Yeah, for sure.
And with that name carries it a certain expectation, and when I think when you venture this far off the path, it becomes
it's tough.
Troublesome.
Yeah, it's troublesome.
I don't know if this is going to completely tank them, or if they're just going to kind of go with it and if they're going to bounce back. But I don't see this record as being one like Paradise Lost one's Host, or 34% Complete by My Dang Bride, where people in hindsight will find some kind of value in it. I think
it's a bad record.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
It's just terrible.
It's just a terrible record, and that seems to be the consensus all around with it. And I mean, iconoclastic artists of genres have been able to get away with this and make their way back. I mean, somebody like a Dylan put out some pretty terrible records in the 80s and 70s at times. I mean, everyone, I don't know, I wouldn't say everyone, but there's certainly artists on that level that were sort of defining of an entire genre. But it's tough,
But see, it would make more sense to me if they actually went completely apeshit. Full on. But this seems like, okay, we're playing a safe song, now we're playing one that's just completely weird that Trey's indulging his own interests.
It does seem very very off balance, and I think you see the beginning of this interest. I mean, Morbid Angel, going back to the Dave Vincent era, has always had an interest in other things, with the classical music interludes on Blessed Are the Sick.
That's kind of the first we really see it.
Yeah, and I think where you really see this use of kind of modern technology was a lot on Domination. Domination, for instance, used
vocal effects,
and they used a lot of electronic metronomes on that record, which was odd at the time.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I like so much about Formulas is that they go back to Covenant era production, and there's no triggers on the drums and things like that. They actually go away from the electronic kind of metronome. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, they had flirted with it on Domination. There are some experiments near the end of Formulas. There were a lot of like stuff that's filler near the very end of the record, which seems odd. Like the last 3 tracks on there are kind of instrumentals, and they just it's really strangely compositionally put together and not spread out very well. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of that in Gateways and a lot of it on Heretic. And I mean, when we get to Heretic later in the show, we'll talk about the fallacies of that record and the things that work and the things that don't. And it's unfortunately a kind of a future predictor of the new one from based on kind of what you've said. You know?
Yeah.
But getting back to, you know, I guess historical context of Formula's Fate of the Flesh, I think it's really important to understand that you have arguably, alongside Chuck Schuldiner, probably the most kind of imposing death metal vocalist of all time, Dave Vincent, leaving. Mm-hmm. Okay, just exiting right at the peak of popularity, because Domination and Covenant were the 2 best-selling records that they had. Yeah. I mean, Domination almost had some mainstream crossover success because it had simplified the sound a little bit. I don't want to say dumbed it down, but there was a little bit more catchy sort of element to it. And so you've got a band that's almost on the peak of like doing something very mainstream, and they're on Giant Records at the time. Mm-hmm. And he walks away to go with his wife's band, the Genitorturers, you know, and so that was kind of odd.
And it always seemed that, I don't know if this is true or not, but just, you know, listening to music and reading interviews and stuff, it always seems like Vincent was the counter to Trey that kept him grounded.
Yeah. And so Trey assumes power at this point.
Yeah.
Giant Records,
the lunatic king kind of thing.
Giant Records is, I didn't know this until I did some research, is going bankrupt at this time, and that's why they go off of Giant back to Earache. Okay. So, you know, all these things are sort of happening. This turmoil is kind of going on. Eric Rutan's sort of left, you know, so now they're a 3-piece with, you know, Trey on guitar. You're bringing the brand new vocalist from Ohio Ceremony, Steve Tucker, who this is the show, the Steve Tucker-era. And then
Rutan's on Gateways, and that's it.
Yes. So, but Rutan left for Formulas, so they're just a 3-piece there. And then you've got, of course, the you know, the great Pete Sandoval on drums there.
Some of his most retardedly fast drums ever.
It's pretty crazy stuff and what he's doing there, you know.
And so, he does it all in combat boots.
Yeah, he's a great guy. You know, and so there's a more bombastic element, I think, with the type of drumming, with the sort of things that Trey's doing with some of his trippy solos on this record.
I mean, it seems like they always have to reestablish themselves.
He's got to remind people, like, this is what we are. Go back to the root essence. So it's a much faster record. The guitar tone is much crunchier in a way, but yet very adept when he needs to go into those super rapid speed parts. Mm-hmm. That's the part that's always been really awesome about Morbid Angel, is whoever was recording them seemed to understand what Trey was always trying to get, which is a super heavy but yet this very clear, at times, like an Eddie Van Halen, Jimi Hendrix kind of rock and roll thing with his sort of trippy, bizarre soloing. You know,
that Blessed Are the Sick documentary that they put out on what was that, a couple years ago, where they actually talk with, is it Tom Morris, or is it where they actually talk about the recording process, like really in depth, which I really got off on, that, you know, actually showing like, oh, here's the modules we used and here's how we did, you know, his solos and all this kind of crap.
Yeah. And so that's kind of the I don't know, the feel of the record, I guess. You know, Tucker's vocals are pretty low key on it. I mean, he's just trying to emulate, I think, really the Covenant style, you know, just the really, really deep Vincent sort of style. There's not a lot of...
He doesn't have the same, like, enunciation or presence that
Vincent... You can't hear his words very well. You know, you can't hear the lyrics very well. He'll get better on Gateways, I think. I think Gateways is his best vocal performance, but this one, he's just kind of, you know, it's very meat and potatoes, but it's a Trey record, you know, it's a Trey and Pete record, really, and he does, I think, an adequate job. And, you know, there's some criticism of Steve Tucker, but I think... Hey, it's a tough job to fill.
I mean, it's like Blaze Bayley coming in to fill in for Bruce Dickinson and Maiden or something, you know? Yeah, it has its merits, but you're holding up to something that there's no way you could possibly reach.
And you've gotten to a point in your life where you've been able to separate the Blaze music from Blaze himself and appreciate some of those songs.
Yeah, X Factor has some decent songs on it.
Same thing with the non-Halford era of Priest, you know, and stuff like that. So all of those things are kind of happening on this record. And then, you know, Prayer of Hatred, which you heard, has some really it has some of those domination elements of the fast, slow kind of stuff going on, where it kind of stops in the middle point there during the chorus, and he's doing those like dun dun dun. Yeah, just really cool, really neat. I
mean, if nothing else, even if you don't like, I've known a handful of people that really don't like death metal at all, but when they heard the kind of riffs that Trey was doing, they're like, his timing is just like ridiculous. Like it's so like he's on completely his own meter, but yet he's completely always on. Yeah, it's like jazz playing or something weird.
Yeah, so he's a talent, and he's I don't know, he's kind of a mad genius, and I think
kind of class.
Unfortunately, things have kind of come to fruition for him in a bad way, in that like this sort of madness that he has kind of led him down the path of Heretic and the new record, in terms of like
Heretic. Yeah, we'll talk about Heretic
not
later,
really knowing
it's not terrible.
What he wants to do.
It's not terrible, but the production is a misstep.
Well, and sometimes he follows. It seems like he gets like an idea in his head that like a 14-year-old would get, but yet he has the money and the resources and nobody really saying no, and the talent to do it, and yet it's an idea that he
well, that's the new record. Eric Rutan recorded parts of it, and then Trey was kind of the master of the rest of it, and it's just it's a disjointed mess.
But let's get into the good stuff, because we've got some Formulas Fatal to Flesh stuff, and we're going to kick off with my favorite track on the album, and it's the Epic song, and it's really, I think, the culmination of the peak, you could say, of Morbid Angel, in a sense. Every style of the first 5 records really is building up to this point, which is Invocation of the Continual Ones, and the fact that, it's a lot of leftover stuff from the Abominations era.
Like 84,
Yeah, and Trey singing vocals on it, which is really cool. It's kind of trippy to hear his raspiness there, gives it sort of a different sense, but there's just so many things when the song kind of stops in the middle and then it kind of takes over for that like glorious 5-minute like finish. I mean, it really sort of lays the path of like what bands like Nile will sort of pick up and do in the like late 90s and early 2000s. It's sort of like
Carl Sanders actually did some solos on Heretic.
He does some solos. A song we were gonna play but end up not having time, God of Our Own Divinity, which I did want to play. He plays the solo on that.
I think that's one that Pete Sandoval wrote.
Oh, did he?
I think he wrote a handful of these later on songs, so at least compose them or something.
That's cool.
He's given writing credits.
Pete. It's too bad that Pete's not in the band. That's probably another counterweight to why things didn't work out the way they did on the new record.
I mean, I think a lot of with some of the interviews I've read, a lot of it comes down to touring, and he can't. He should have recorded. Well, I think it's kind of good he didn't record the record actually, because that gives some kind of validity to. Okay, well, Pete's not in the band, but so it's not a Morbid Angel record, and now it's not a Morbid Angel record because it sucks.
Yeah, there you go. So we've got Invocation of the Continual Ones, and then we've got Chambers of Dis, which is some really cool trippy like kind of racing solos that adds like kind of a galloping feel to it. And then we're going to come out with Nothing Is Not, which we'll talk a little bit more about that song when we come back. So enjoy.
How can you
Nothing Is Not, Chambers of Dis, and Invocation to the Continual Ones from Formula's Fate of the Flesh.
Is Dis some kind of...
It's probably
Necronomicon thing?
Yeah, I bet.
Or is it like this, but, the abbreviated version?
I would guess, because one of the things I've gathered, is Trey, usually composes most of the lyrics, at least on this era. Steve Tucker contributes, I think, a little bit maybe on Gateways.
Yeah.
But here, Steve's just kind of filling in and doing the best he can. But yeah, there's a lot of like weird stuff. Hymn to a Gas Giant, which is like his like Eddie Van Halen eruption, Trey style, you know. Ascent Through the Spheres, Hypnos Ritualis, De Guero, Trooper, Bil Ur Sag, Disturbance and Great Slumber, Lambrari, just a lot of weird Sumerian, Mesopotamian kind of, like you said, H.P. Lovecraft kind of stuff.
The further they go, the kind of less cohesive the themes and of the albums kind of seem to be.
Yeah, this one's kind of all over the place, and unfortunately, it suffers from a horrendous. This and Gateways to Annihilation both have terrible covers. And
Gateways has a good cover.
Really?
Gateways has a Dan Seagrave cover.
That's a Dan Seagrave. I never liked that cover.
It doesn't bother me. It's way better than Heretic.
Well, yeah. This and Heretic, the color schemes
none of them
really
none
weird.
of them fit, and the topography on Formula is just awful.
Yeah.
You're setting up Formula's Fatal of Flesh all in these vertical columns. It's stupid.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, and the other thing that's weird, the thing I guess that I didn't like about this era of covers too, is that like I look at like Altars as like such a classic cover, and then Blessed of the Sick with the painting is very like, it was unique for death metal at the time, and then Covenant is just so suggestive of fucking evil,
but like through like the eye of Danzig, where it's mainstreamish for people to understand,
yeah.
but then Dominations I think is terrible.
It's pretty terrible, yeah. Although
it's like a slime pit.
It's really like predictive of like these type of covers, I guess.
And I think it was, it came out on Giant. It was kind of a product of its time as far as like, okay, here's some computer generated crap we're going to throw in.
That's the problem, and that comes back to this idea of technology in the late 90s and stuff like that. And I think, Trey almost got trapped in that in a way, and he never was like able to emerge from that. He was into the weird earache kind of techno metal sort of weird stuff,
the power violence and shit that was
being put out, and I feel like he was drawing a lot of influences from that, like on Heretic and then certainly on the new record, and it's kind of weird. But one thing I wanted to say about Nothing Is Not, the song you just heard there, very sort of sludgy and slow, and to me this is like the template for Gateways to Annihilation, which is a much slower record than Formula's Fate of the Flesh. It kind of takes the model of Domination and the template that Domination had, which was a lot of the sort of Where the Slime Lives, Caesar Palace, stuff that was just more deliberately, I guess, sludgy, and we were trying to where
I think it's got a very New York death metal vibe, but more, I guess more in the production and like the rhythm guitar than the leads or anything. But I really feel it's got more of an American feel, because Morbid Angel never felt like an American band early on.
No, they like you knew they were from Florida, but yet they felt. I mean, I don't know if it was the same way that you knew Hendrix was part of the psychedelic scene, but he almost sounded like he was from another planet most of the time. That's kind of what Morbid Angel I think is kind of upon themselves. They don't have any peers, at least in the early era they had no peers whatsoever. Well, I mean, they were half black metal, it seemed like, in terms of their imagery and some of the lyricism, and then they had
the first picture I saw of on the back of Altars of Madness with Trey with like blood coming out of his mouth, and he almost looked like he had like a Moon-Ra face from Thundercats. He's just like really screwed up looking, hearing those riffs and seeing the Immortal Rights video, and it's like, this stuff is legit. See Dave Vincent on the grind. The Hard and Heavy. Grind Crusher Special. Or Grind Crusher Special,
yeah. But, and so Nothing Is Not is kind of the reason why I wanted to end with that song, is to sort of show you that sort of template of the slow, sort of sludgy kind of stuff. Which leads us into our next set, which we have one more tune from Formulas, which is Covenant of Death. And what's really cool about this song is, again, it comes back to the slow kind of crushing doom part, but it's super fast at the very beginning. Lots of wild solos and fast, powerful sort of stuff, and then it like has this like really like weird abrupt stop, which Morbid has done before. They do it on songs off Covenant, and even songs from Blessed of the Sick. Like the title track itself has that like really weird abrupt kind of ending, and then it goes into the
next movement.
Leading to the Rats, the super slow, sludgy kind of stuff. But Covenant of Death is kind of in that same formula. And then just really doomy, and even like an acoustic passage in the middle of it, which was fairly odd for Morbid at that time. That was one thing they had.
Most of the other stuff was like Richard Burnell that did, on Blast. So.
Yeah, didn't he do mostly like classical type stuff though? And this is almost more of like a, I don't know, the way, just the way like anybody would insert acoustic guitars into a death metal song. It was like traditional, not like classical, the way that Morbid Angel had sort of approached it. So, and then we'll transition into sort of the Gateways to Annihilation record, which we guess we should talk about. As you mentioned before, Eric Rutan comes back, and he's a guy that, it's too bad he didn't stick around more, because I feel like he maybe could talk some sense into Trey, because he's a guitar player, because he's a producer, because he's...
I think he was smart to leave.
Oh, well, it made sense for him.
Because the stuff, the stuff he did with Hate Eternal, and still is doing with Hate Eternal, kind of took... I think it's kind of in the Morbid Angel school, as far as like it's really kind of abrasive and confrontational music, and it's really kind of unconventional, his riff, choices and stuff like that. So I don't know if he could have saved Heretic or not. I think it was good for him to just like spread his wings and go. And
and just
he's been, he's had a relationship as far as like helping with production and stuff since. But.
Yeah. And then, this is a record where Steve Tucker's vocals really start to take on more dynamic. He's starting to do some kind of vocal whispering sort of thing. He does some raspy, almost like black metal-ish stuff on a couple of songs.
He's got some dynamic instead of just the guttural stuff that he's doing ceremony.
Yeah, and he gets dissed a lot, and it's really unfortunate. I mean, he does have a meat and potatoes kind of approach, but Dave Vincent, other than kind of doing some of the stuff through the vocal, the stuff on Domination, and then his his great stuff on like God of Emptiness is pretty like amazing. His, I guess, talked chant vocals, that stuff. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty iconic, and different.
But he's not. I don't think Vincent's not like a standout bass player.
No.
But he was a personality, and he was an anchor to that band. And Steve Tucker was relatively unknown. He had, I think, a demo and maybe an EP with Ceremony before
they
he
put out
joined.
a lot of stuff. Yeah.
So I mean, it was kind of. I think a lot of people are probably pissed that. Well, why the hell does this guy get to be in Morbid Angel? I've got way more experience. Yeah, it was probably a lot of sour grapes.
Yeah, and I think overall it represents an era too in death metal, which is this sort of, American death metal had really played itself out by mid 90s. The torch was definitely passed to Europe, with especially the Swedish stuff that was kind of going on with that.
Power metal was starting to come up at that time.
Absolutely, and Morbid was fighting for its life to get some sort of validity and still have a sense of purpose, and I think Formulas and Gateways did a lot to at least keep them alive when a lot of bands really fell off the radar screen for me. Certainly, I couldn't tell you anything about, Incantation or Immolation during that era, or a lot of the other, American metal bands or American
bands.
Yeah, Death certainly made a different name for themselves by going in a totally different direction with Symbolic and Sound of Perseverance. They kind of were doing their own thing.
With Control Denied and, experiments like that.
Absolutely. And so I think, just being able to put out Formulas and Gateways, two records, which I don't think there's very many people that could listen to those records and not say that there isn't a lot of valuable compositional musicianship to those two records.
If Gateways was put out now, it would be well received.
Sure, absolutely. It just came out in a really weird era. Early 2000s was such a it was just it
was a renaissance shift. And it was a passing of the torch, as you're saying, to a lot of these other bands. And it was, I think that era, it wasn't so much about pure death metal, pure black metal. It was about like the walls are starting to break down, and different genres were starting to mash together at that point too.
Yep. And so and so that's probably one of the reasons why I listened to this record. I remember playing a couple songs when I did the radio show off of this, but I never really got excited about this record. It just kind of seemed like, oh, look, it's a Morbid Angel record. It was kind of like when a new Obituary record came out. You're like,
or it's like Iron Maiden, No Prayer for the Dying.
There you go. Yeah.
Oh, another Iron Maiden record.
Yeah, here it is. Yeah, here it is.
So hopefully they'll have their, their, like how Maiden had their 2000, or was it? Yeah, 2000
Brave New World.
Since they've had this kind of like renaissance of inspiration. It'd be nice if Trey and company could put down this last record and like, okay, let's really think about what we want to do. Are we gonna go on as Morbid Angel, or are we gonna go on as Radicult?
Yeah. Oh man. So let's get into some Gateway stuff. We, what I like about this record, I'll say this, and this might be a criticism of formulas. Formulas seem to be kind of all over the map, which is cool for a variety standpoint. But what I do appreciate about Gateways is there's a really big musical cohesion throughout. It almost seems like thematic, and that's like both good and bad, because at the same time, you can't really pick out a lot of individual tracks. You put the record on together, and you go, oh, this is a good record. Yeah. It really reminds me of the New Immortal in a sense, where like it bled together thematically in the way that like all the songs sort of fit really nicely together. It didn't have
one riff is kind of like blends into the next kind
exactly.
of thing.
And that's one of the things I think that maybe in the early 2000s, when we were looking for dynamic kind of like music that was drawing on indie rock and drawing on this and like the Mastodons and the ISIS and Electric, all
this stuff.
Yeah, just bands that were really like blending a lot of different musical things. This seemed very meat and potatoes probably in hindsight, but
especially the way I used to go through my promos when we actually used to get them on CDs, labels. If you'd start doing that again, people would
be awesome,
I think, be more into it. You give 30 seconds per track. You skip, just to give a cursory evaluation of the whole thing. And this was just.
And it's the wrong way to listen to Morbid, because you're missing out on those juicy, trippy leads that are always buried in the
solos that are at the very end or something that just kind of like hurries the whole song out.
Exactly. But we've got Covenant of Death, and then we're going to blend into Opening of the Gates from Gateways to Annihilation. And what's really cool about this, first of all, the drumming is just off the charts, as Mark sort of said.
But the beats per minute are just almost unhuman.
But what I like about this is if you listen to the sort of staccato kind of stuff that's happening, I really feel like this song out Meshuggah's Meshuggah. It takes that same kind of approach that Meshuggah had, but it like shows them up and shows them we can go faster than you, be more technical, and be way more interesting than a lot of the stuff that Meshuggah does.
Well, even as kind of blindly fast as a lot of a lot of Pete's drums are. It has this weird kind of like undulation, almost like a swing that keeps the whole thing, propelling forward.
And he does a lot of really cool choice things. Like he'll be like hitting like the same beat for like a while, but then he'll like change it up just a little bit to, like you said, give it a little bit of swing or something. Where it's just like
always movement. It's propelled forward. It's not just like completely like blinding like a grindcore track or something.
Absolutely. And so then we go from Opening the Gates into He Who Sleeps, which is kind of the ultimate sludge masterpiece for Morbid, and then to the Victor the Spoils, which has some cool like kind of rock and roll soloing, and then we're going to kind of come out with At One with Nothing. So enjoy.
Listen wisdom for working for cultural force and form. The lightning flash they are, they bring the word and it becomes. The source of which we fall. We lift ourselves on a path that brings us to our dream. The particular force we praise is from the being our highest hope. Make away our yours, free me into the side. Decisions are committed to eternal disappointment. For now, we're only shield is the ignorance in which they hide. In the shadow of their fears, they feel the gnashing teeth and weeping. on your feet. We are the The listless drive of counting years, impeding on one's perception of what is to be. Awaken to see a God, a desertion. God of lies, enlightened by a way deceiving only truth to the blind. Salvation that you seek is empty, no God of light. The freedom that instead your fate you accept with ease. By the signs that lay before you, destroy your beliefs. Awaken to be at one with nothing. Now all will be saved.
One with nothing to the victor, the spoils, he who sleeps, opening of the gates, and then from Formulas Fate of the Flesh, Covenant of Death.
Opening the gates, Satan. I think that's a black or Dark Funeral song.
Is it? Yeah.
Or that's lyric, but
from In the Dark or from the.
Oh, from the first EP.
Yeah, In the Dark EP, is it?
No, it's
Why am I thinking? Yeah, I can't.
It doesn't matter. We're not talking about Dark Funeral right now.
Although they are also hyper fast in the way that Morbid Angel sometimes can be. Which, we arrive finally at Heretic, which is probably, the dud of the Steve Tucker kind of trio of records.
It's the Return of the Jedi.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, maybe. I like Return of the Jedi more than I like Heretic. Let's put it that way. Even though it does have Ewoks on it, though it's sort of like ridden with some Ewoks and some cheesy.
Jedi's fine, but I was just making fun of George Lucas because he has too much credit.
There you go. I was telling Mark, off mic in between sets here, that what I like about this record is it seems to be like an angry statement that they're trying to make. It's very hate filled. It is an H record. Yeah, it is an H record. It's much faster in a way than the stuff that you heard on Gateways, which was a more deliberately sort of slower record compared to, say, the speed of Formulas. But he just doesn't do himself any favors, because the way that he filters everything is this compressed, kind of heavy mid-range sound.
Well, the producer was somebody that I'm not really familiar with who they are. I've never heard their name, in conversation about anything. It almost seems like, oh, he's a friend of mine, he's going to, produce this thing. But it seemed like if you took any of their other records and stripped, put some kind of like noise gate compressor on the thing and took out all of the highs and the real lows, and it almost sounded like a really low bitrate MP3 by the time it was all done. It's kind of boring.
Yeah, it doesn't work, I mean, Pete is aces. I mean, Pete is great still even throughout. I mean, it's some of his best performances. It's just too bad that you have to sift through the bad production to sort of hear that stuff.
Well, and a lot of the bad interlude type, whatever you even want to call it.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad interruptions. I mean, there's even a song which it's cool to hear it, but do it as a bonus track. Drum Check. And it's actually like a song on the record. It's not even on the bonus CD. It's just called Drum Check. And it's Trey. It's cool. It's a drum solo, but it's not what I expect at this point. Yeah,
he needs guidance.
Yeah, there wasn't.
That can be the problem.
There's a lot of interruptions
with really good musicians that don't have a good producer that can kind of like screw their head on right, or ask them the right questions to say, okay, maybe I don't need 15 riffs in this song, just 4 would be great.
And it's probably some of unfortunately for Trey, it's a double-edged sword, because it's the same qualities that make him kind of a musical genius that also ruin a lot of what made Morbid Angel great. Because he is so far off the beaten path from what most of us consider normal in terms of how we would approach doing a song, which has made Morbid Angel's music very interesting throughout the years, but it's also led to where we are now, which is Heretic and then the new record. So I don't know, it's a shame, because there is a really cool old school kind of approach to this record, Heretic. Very late 80s, early 90s in terms of, like I said, some of the anger and the hate-filledness of it. And even like a song like we're going to play, like Curse the Flesh, has this really like awesome catchy crunch during the chorus that just sounds like so like 1989, 1990 earache kind of sounding. Enshrined by Grace has some really like tripped out kind of cool solo choices and guitar leads and things, but then it's not enough, So almost
these last couple records could, like maybe just Heretic. If Heretic was an EP as well, it probably would have been.
Or if they could get it remastered with it, if they could find those master tapes and have somebody like have Morris Sound, redo it. But Trey would never do that,
Yeah.
And it might not.
They don't often seem to look backwards very often.
No, which is cool. That's a good quality in some ways, and maybe someday Trey will prove us all wrong, and blend all of these zany video game manga ridden ideas into some ingenious kind of thing, and we'll all he'll have the last laugh.
Or they'll just be big in Germany.
Yeah. In Japan and stuff like that. Yeah. So, but so again, it's kind of interesting to look back at the Steve Tucker era, not nearly as boring or uninspired as one would think, other than Heretic's poor production. I think, if you had a great production on that, there were enough decent songs, God of Our Own Divinity, we mentioned before, is Carl Sanders, doing solos on it, Beneath the Hollow, Cleanse and Pestilence, which is cool, punky vibe. Has enough good songs on it that it still would have been a great record, I think, or not great, but at least above average, and a pretty decent death metal record. And so I don't think Steve Tucker's the guy that should take the fall for this. I think, unfortunately, Trey's got to look himself in the mirror, and it's been proven now with this new record that it was never Steve Tucker's fault that these records got the reputation that they did.
Well, yeah, now it's Dave Vincent's fault as well, because he wrote Reticle.
He's on it. Yep. And so you got to bear the burden. So
it's a guy who's been out of the scene for too long and doesn't know what's going on. It's like somebody that did like awesome, like really stripped down rock and roll in the 50s and tries to recapture that now.
Yeah,
it doesn't work usually.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, Jerry Lee Lewis and
Jerry Lee Lewis is still okay if he plays his own old songs.
he did, but who's the guy I'm thinking of? Blue Suede Shoes guys, Carl Perkins.
Carl Perkins, yeah.
His stuff that he did like later on in the 70s and 80s.
No,
Not good.
No.
Not good. The stuff he did with Johnny Cash on Folsom Prison was pretty cool, but no. Anyways, back to Morbid Angel. So let us know what you thought. Let us know what your opinion on the Steve Tucker era is, and I'm sure you have opinions on the new Morbid Angel record as well. Shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com or check us out on iTunes. Leave us a review on iTunes and stuff. That'd be great. Or check us out on Facebook.
Be a friend of us on Facebook.
Yeah.
We like to have friends. Sometimes when we have friends on Facebook, they become real life friends.
They do.
Like Mr. Wes Cueto.
That's
how it's pronounced.
Yeah, and in Adrian, I feel like Adrian
Soul.
Once we meet him officially, we'll commiserate with some
brothers of metal,
brothers of metal,
as they say.
But and then check us out at requiempodcast.com where you can
become an executive producer of the show, where you can help us because this show is not free. We have to pay for web hosting, we pay for mics, computers, all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
It is incredibly helpful if you guys like to chip in a couple bucks more than a couple bucks. Usually everybody is pretty right on the money with what they decide to donate. So whatever you think our show is worth, you become the executive producer. That means you help make this show possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, we appreciate that. So, all right, for Heretic and Requiem Metal Podcast, we've got Curse the Flesh and Enshrined by Grace. I'm Jason.
And I am Mark, the Heretic.
Eternally bleed. This is a This world is fallen, scorching bare. The rage of lunatics shall lead us nevermore. The hand love forgotten shall feed the prisoner.